Hey, thanks for tuning in. In this video, I'm going to talk about 8 ways we add to the Torah. Deuteronomy 4:2 and 12:32 command us to not add to the commands and to not take away from the commands. And the fact is that very few people that actually believe in the Torah, that actually believe in applying it as it is commanded and seeking to do the commands as such, very few people intentionally violate this command. Instead, this is kind of one of those commands where we might look at it and say, obviously those people out there are doing it, people that are obviously rejecting the law, that are changing the system that was set up by Elohim for his people. It's easy to see it going on in those cases, but there are also other ways that the law can be added to and taken away from, ways that we may not even realize are being done. So these are 8 ways that the law can be changed, either by adding to it or taking away from it. The first one is assume the meaning is more important than the command. For many of us, we are compelled to know why a command was given. We want to know the meaning behind a command. We want to know the purpose of the command. And if we knew why a command was given, that might help us in knowing how to apply that command, how to observe it. And so there are a lot of people out there that are asking these questions. What is the purpose of that? Why are we doing that? Why am I supposed to do this command? And very few commands in the Torah actually say why. Very few of them give us the reason that the command was given. And so, as a result, if someone is going to provide an answer for why a command was given, that answer has to come from somewhere other than the text, very likely. Somewhere other than the law. And so there is this potential that it is not the correct meaning. It is not the correct reason for the command. And very often, if that resonates with people, if people think that, maybe that might sound right, that seems right, they will start to believe it's true. And we may start to believe it's true even if we just frame it as an idea that we had or a speculation that we heard. We start understanding that command in the light of the meaning. And if that meaning is not correct, then it is misleading us as to how the command is supposed to be applied. We are reviewing the text through that meaning. And of course, this innocent seeming process can lead to us misinterpreting it and maybe even not paying attention to what the text really says. One way that this often takes place is with the clean and unclean commands. That oftentimes people will say that it's because of health, but the law never actually says that these commands are because of health. If anything, the reason that it might imply at one point is because we are to be separated from the rest of the people, so we are separating between the clean and the unclean. So this idea of it being about health, it colors the way that people interpret the command. Because then we start hearing things about someone's supposedly clean animals, it's a clean animal normally, becoming unclean. An idea that has no basis in the actual commands, but because the animals are sick, they're being viewed as unclean. So in that case, this meaning behind the command that one has assumed, it is informing a person as to how they are interpreting the law. It is informing them in a non-textual way. And the interesting thing about these meanings and having the meaning take precedence for us, it can even take place in the case that the meaning is textual. And so we can let these meanings not only override what the text says, but cause us to not see what the text says. We might assume, even though it won't be deliberately, we might assume that the meaning is more important than the command. The second way that we might change the law is through assuming an implicit command. Our beliefs regarding right and wrong and regarding morality, a lot of times they did not come entirely from the Torah, especially for those of us that were not learning the Torah in our youth, that came to the Torah later on. We had a previous belief system, we had previous ideas about what was right and what was wrong, and whenever we came to the awareness of the Torah, it is not like all of those previous beliefs just disappeared. It's not like they were just swept away. And so a lot of times we will continue to assume that those things must be right and those things must be wrong. And as a result, as we start learning the law, we may think, well, I'm not sure exactly where the law teaches that, but it must be a part of the law either because of my previous beliefs, and we wouldn't think of it that way. We would just assume because it's so obvious to us that it's an issue of right and wrong, so it must be in there, or because of our previous experiences or the things that we pay a lot of attention to in our day-to-day life. We are going to assume that those things must somehow be in the law. And if we start looking and trying to find where it actually commands it, we may realize that there is no explicit command that says anything about that. And depending upon how strongly we are clinging to that idea, we may decide there must be some implicit command regarding that. There must be some way that the text implies that command, even though it never plainly states it as a command. But depending upon how much we want it to be in there, we may want to extract an implicit command out of the law, something that is not actually commanded in the law, which obviously would result in changing it. We would be assuming an implicit command. And number 3 is assuming an elusive hidden meaning. Assuming an elusive hidden meaning is kind of the taking away from the law version of assuming an implicit command. Because just like we might assume that something must be an issue of the law because we had placed importance on it in the past through our experiences or through our previous beliefs, we may also have things that we do not place emphasis on, that we do not give much attention to, and that we do not think are any issues of significance. And these may be things like gardening practices, farming practices, things like the way that we dress. We may not really place much emphasis on that, and we may not think that it could be any issue of right and wrong, that it could be any issue of Elohim's command. And so as a result, whenever we notice that these commands are in the law, commands regarding sowing mixed seed, for example, or commands regarding doing or making the tzitzit on our garments, we might see these commands and think, that doesn't seem right. I don't think that that's what's intended. And so there must be some other elusive hidden meaning behind it. Now, the fact is that usually we never find out what that elusive hidden meaning should be. And as a result, the command kind of just gets pushed to the side because we assume that it must not really be what it says it is, and therefore it must be irrelevant. So as a result, obviously, if we're just not paying attention to a command, we are not paying attention to it, not following it, and essentially taking away from the law. We are effectively removing it from the law in such a case. So assuming an elusive hidden meaning can cause us to take away from the law. Number 4 is assume an authoritative previous learning. For those of us that had previous beliefs, that had a previous belief system that we followed before we came to the Torah, usually it follows sort of a pattern how this came about. We had our previous belief system in the past, and then at some point this started kind of loosening up. We started kind of opening up our thoughts on it, started kind of wondering about certain things. And over a period of time, eventually we came to the awareness of the Torah and realized, okay, this is what we're going to do. This is what we are turning to now. And then there was this period of time where we were still open. We were wanting to know, okay, what are all of the commands? How do I do that? How do I establish this habit of observance? How do I establish my practice of observing the Torah? And what is it that I believe about it? And after we came to answer those various questions, that loosening up that we had before, that opening up of our thoughts on the issue, we start to settle that down. We start to kind of close off more, and we tend to kind of settle into a more stable state. And this is a natural way of going about things. Obviously, living our lives constantly wondering about all of these important issues can be rather taxing. So it's very natural for us to gravitate toward a more closed state, to a more stable state. Now, one of the issues of that is that when we were in this process of first learning about the Torah, first establishing what our practice was, first establishing these habits of observance and what we believed about it, when we were learning about it, we were probably relatively ignorant about the law. We probably didn't know all that we could have known at this point in time. We probably knew much less, and we probably didn't have the ability to discern as well regarding things that are according to the Torah, regarding interpretations that are more correct, and it would be difficult to actually assess that not knowing the Torah that well. And so the interesting thing about this process is that once we get to a point where we have learned more about it and where we have the ability to learn more about it, oftentimes we close ourselves off to learning more. And so we stick in this habit that we've already established for ourselves, these interpretations that we learned from other people, maybe from the ways that we first learned to do things. We stick with that instead of opening up the possibility that maybe there is more to learn. Maybe there are things that I should be doing differently. Maybe I didn't learn 100% right the first time. And so as a result, this kind of closing off that we might get into, this, I don't understand it that way, the way that I learned it is this, getting into those kinds of habits of things, we close ourselves off and we might end up adding to the law or taking away from the law because we are assuming those initial learnings to be correct, because we're not willing to update our observance, to continue learning and to update what we are doing as a result. And as I mentioned in a previous video, if our practice and our observance is almost identical to the way that it was when we first started observing, there's probably something that we need to learn. It's probably not the case that we learned 100% correctly everything about the law at the very beginning. There probably is still something else to learn, and occasionally loosen ourselves up, open ourselves up to the possibility of learning some different way to do something. So assuming an authoritative previous learning can close us off to learning the correct way and to updating our observance as appropriate. Number 5 is assume we can fill in the blanks in the text. Just like with most of the rest of these issues, I'm pretty sure that people are not just going about thinking, okay, I'm going to go assume an implicit command, or I'm going to go force a certain command to be in the law or to not be in the law. We're not approaching it that way. It's just something that's going on kind of as a byproduct of our previous beliefs or a byproduct of just how we're thinking about things. And we don't really know that it's going on all the time. Now, we may not even be aware that such a thing could take place, let alone whether we are doing it. And this assuming that we can fill in the blanks, there are a lot of commands that whenever we look at them, we may not actually see what the text says. We already have kind of an explanation for the command, or maybe a teaching regarding that command in our minds. And so whenever we see that, instead of seeing exactly what it says for what it says, we are automatically calling up all of those learnings that we had before, that previous understanding. We are automatically filling in the blanks. And this can go on very easily and not even allow us to realize that it is. And we will assume that, we really know what's going on because of this teaching that we believe to be true. But the problem is that if we are not able to see what the text says, then we may not be seeing what the text says, and we may not be following it according to the text. And one way that this extremely commonly goes on is the beliefs regarding the rituals and the sacrifices. And this was something that I know that I did for a long time, and it took me quite a while to realize that something else was going on. And so I invite everyone to check out these rituals and sacrifices explained in Leviticus, chapters 1 through 9, for example, and pay attention to where the command says we are supposed to do it. What does the command say regarding where this is being done, how it is supposed to be done specifically, and specifically paying attention to that, because almost everyone is filling in the blanks. About every article that I have seen about these issues, about these rituals, and about the things that are commanded at the end of Exodus and in the rituals of Leviticus, they are framed completely differently from the way that they actually say they are to be done. So this is something that we can check into and see, have we been paying attention to exactly what it says? This is something that is difficult to do, and it can be difficult to even realize that we are not doing it. So assuming that we can fill in the blanks, assuming that we know what is really going on, whenever we're calling up these meanings and these ideas of, okay, this means this, well, that's maybe what we're seeing. We may not be seeing the text anymore. Number 6 is assume others' actions equal the commands of the law. If we accept the conventional Calvinist Bible canon that was assembled in 1646, or if we accept the Tanakh, there are plenty of examples of different people in those books that we may assume to be righteous. There are plenty of examples of different people that lived in different ways, and we may see, for example, the patriarchs of Genesis, and we may see things that they did. And as a result, we may conclude that, well, they did something, and so the law must conform to what they did. Or we may see something like in the latter parts of the Tanakh, in the prophets or in the writings parts, or we may see something in the New Testament and see different people doing different things and assume that the law must conform to that because we believe these people to be in the right, because we assume that they must really know what's going on. Now, the problem is that there are a lot of examples of many different figures in the Tanakh and also in the New Testament that were not following the commands, that not everything they did was according to the commands. And some of these violations are very blatant. Some of them are very easy to see if we are open to seeing them. But the issue is that we might close ourselves off to seeing them. We may not even be able to see them because we believe in these figures, because we assume that they must be doing the right thing. And of course, if they're not doing the right thing, that may lead to us changing the law. That may lead to us taking away from the law or forcing the law to fit what these other people did. And we do this through assuming others' actions equal the commands of the law. Number 7 is assume prophecies or teachings equal the law. For a lot of us, this is going to be easy to recognize with the example of the oral Torah. There are some that believe that there was an oral Torah that was revealed alongside the written Torah, and that there are also these authoritative rabbinic enactments and these rabbinic traditions that are not adding to or taking away from the law. They are just expounding upon it in an authoritative way. Now, for most of us, we can clearly see that that is not allowed by the Torah, and that's not consistent with what the Torah says. Now, part of the reason for that probably is because these rabbinic traditions and the oral Torah and so forth, this was not a part of our previous beliefs. Beliefs in those teachers, beliefs in those works were not a part of our previous beliefs. So it's easy to recognize when those things are not in line with the Torah because we weren't necessarily inclined to assume that it must be. And so the problem is with prophets that we assume must be correct, prophets that we believe strongly in and maybe that we believed in before we accepted the Torah, before we realized that the Torah mattered. These beliefs that we have had and that we have carried in might impact whether we are even able to see what the Torah says in the case that there is genuinely some issue. For example, there is one prophet in the Tanakh that says there are these new Torah that are being given in that prophecy. And sometimes whenever this is brought up, the response is that, well, it's not adding to the law, it's just adding new ways for us to act in the future. It's just explaining how things are to be from now on. Now, obviously, we can see that that's just rewording it. It's not changing what's going on. That's the same thing as saying that it's adding to the law. But the problem is that if we are getting into that, where we're cleverly rewording things to ourselves and kind of explaining that away, we may convince ourselves that we don't need to worry about it. We may convince ourselves that, no, there isn't any problem here. There is nothing wrong. It's just elaboration upon the Torah. It's just, it must be in line with what's really being taught in the Torah, because we have to believe that these prophets or these teachers continue to be correct, because they may actually be a higher priority to us than the commands. And obviously, if that is going on, and in the case that it is, it's likely outside of our awareness, at least outside of our most of our awareness. There's probably some part of us that's a little bit aware of it, but doesn't really want us to address it yet. And so, in the case that's going on, we might be adding to the law or taking away from the law as a result, because the law is not being put first. Instead, we are forcing the law to fit with those teachings, with those prophecies. So assuming that a prophet or a teacher must be correct, and assuming that prophecies or teachings must be correct, can lead us to change the law. And number 8 is assume an edited command. The fact is that the Torah was edited, and we know this to be true because there are different manuscripts. The fact that different manuscripts exist is proof that at some point one of them was changed. At some point there was a manuscript that was changed, and as a result we have these differences. Now, a lot of these changes don't really amount to much. Most of them are just slight differences in wordings or spellings, but there are some differences in the commands. One example of this is the difference between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. Are we sacrificing on Mount Ebal when we enter into the land of Canaan, or are we sacrificing on Mount Gerizim? That is a difference that would be rooted in which manuscript we trusted. And one thing that can go on that goes a step further than this is to assume that even though there are no manuscripts that support a particular view, that the original manuscript, hypothetically, must have supported a particular belief that we have. Now, most of us are not going to go down this path, but this path can be pursued by some people. I've seen it take place with those that have very little awareness of the law, and also those that have strong awareness of the law. It can take place either way. One example of this is having strong vegan beliefs and assuming that animals must be treated on more or less an equivalent level as to that of humans. And obviously we know that's not the case, because in the Torah we are allowed to eat animals, we are allowed to sacrifice animals and commanded to, and so forth. And so we know that that's not actually what's going on in those manuscripts, but someone might have a strong belief, just like we might assume an implicit command. We might have a strong belief regarding something being right or wrong, or we may be paying a lot of attention to something. We may be putting a lot of emphasis on something in our personal focus, in our personal thinking. And so if we believe in the idea of the Torah at the same time, we might assume that there must be a way these two things can coexist. And one way we might arrive at is that the text was edited. The original text must have said what I think it should have said. And so obviously this is an example that's kind of more extreme than the other ones, but it does take place nonetheless. It is a way that we can add to the law or take away from the law if we really try hard enough. So we have these 8 different ways, and there are probably more, that we can add to the law and take away from the law. We might assume the meaning is more important than the command. Or we might assume an implicit command. Or assume an elusive hidden meaning. We might assume an authoritative previous learning and not be open to updating our observance. Or we might assume we can fill in the blanks in the text. Also, we might assume that others' actions are equivalent to the commands of the law. Or we might assume that prophecies or teachings are equal to the law. Or finally, we might even assume an edited command. We might assume this as an explanation for what should be there but is not. Usually these things come about unintentionally. We don't even intend to do them. They are completely unintentional, and all our intentions are to follow the Torah and to learn the Torah. But in the process, we may be susceptible to one of these things, and we may not even realize that such a thing could go on, but it might. There might be things that we have that we believe from previous beliefs. There might be things that we are placing emphasis on, or there might be things that we do not place emphasis on. And then we might see in the Torah that the Torah places emphasis a certain way, or it doesn't place emphasis a certain way. And we might think that there must be a way that this can all be reconciled. And as a result, our mind tries to fix it for us. Our mind tries to solve the problem rather than troubling us further with trying to actually figure it out and maybe revise some of our previous beliefs. So as much as possible, we have to try to kind of guard ourselves and try to pay attention to the text of the Torah, pay attention to what the commands say exactly, and try to glean as much as we can from what the Torah says, to learn the Torah from the Torah so that we are not adding to the law or taking away from the law. Thanks for watching, and remember the commands. Shalom.